according to God, what provoked him to reject their worship, what he calls vain worship, is when those that profess that they're worshiping God are acting outwardly in defiance to his commandments. Does that make sense? So if I say, I worship the one true God, but then I act in defiance to his commandments, God says that's vain worship. Like that's empty. You can say all day long, you worship me, but your actions say something different. See, God made it very clear how the poor were to be treated in the congregation, right? You have the widows, you have the orphans, you have the poor. And they were not to be treated as outcasts. They were not to be looked down upon. They were not to be abused or taken advantage of. And we also know what God thinks about judgment, right? That's why he gave laws that said if somebody does this, this is what's supposed to happen to them. And he gave very specific laws so that Moses and the elders weren't left in the dark wondering how to judge God's people, how to settle matters between God's people, how to deal with sin issues amongst God's people, how to deal with arguments, how to deal with contentions, how to deal with somebody does somebody wrong. And so they're not left in the dark about it. God gives them specific judgments. And so if they walk according to God's judgments, they do well. But what's happening here in Israel is that they were not walking according to God's judgments. In fact, they disregarded God's judgments altogether and began to abuse their power, began to take advantage of people, began to put their thumb on the back of the poor, began to take away from those people that needed. They begin to take for themselves. And so you have this class warfare, if you would, where you have the high aristocrats, and then you have the very poor, and it's the aristocrats that are taking from the poor, and they're living high on the hog. There's no justice. Nothing's equitable. They're taking bribes. You want to win a lawsuit? Just bribe the judge, and you can win the lawsuit. Justice was thrown out the door, gone out the window. It's not about getting something right. It's about padding my pockets. It's about growing my assets. It's about me living in the lap of luxury. And it was something that repeated all throughout the nation so that the poor were being oppressed and they were being abused. We even know from earlier scriptures in Amos that they were actually taking the poor that were indebted to them and selling them like a piece of property into slavery. Their own people. Selling their brothers and their sisters into slavery. Selling some of them even as sex slaves. If you go back and read the early part of Amos. I mean, just a horrendous way to treat someone that is part of your family. Right? We talked about this Sunday morning. They were brought together by God. They were a people that existed because God created them in such a way. And they were to reflect the goodness of God towards his people. And yet what you see here is oppression. You see hatred. You see mistreatment, injustice, abuse. All kinds of crimes and transgressions committed against one another that ultimately was a transgression against God. But wait a minute. Yet all the while, let's go burn a sacrifice to God. Let's go sing to the Lord. Let's lift up our voice to the Lord. Let's go and have this solemn assembly and have this feast day where we're going to celebrate the goodness of God and we're going to give thanks to God. And all the while, they've rejected his commandments. So that leads me to think this, according to the scriptures, that worship that is disregarding the commandments of God is vain worship. Like to say, I worship you, Lord, but then care nothing about what God's word says. Say, well, I care about what God's word says. If we truly care about it, then we're going to walk in obedience to it. Correct? So if I say I'm worshiping God, then that means this. If I'm genuinely worshiping him, then I'm going to be walking in what his word says for me to do. Like I'm going to regard his word and his commandments and step into them on a daily basis. Now, don't get me wrong. Are we perfect at that? Have we mastered that? I've not mastered that. But there's that desire to, and so that recognition of whenever I don't, We confess that, because that's what his word tells us to do. Confess. Confess our faults one to another. That means this: if I transgress against one of you, and I recognize that, and I'm supposed to confess that to you. If you confront me with that and you say, yeah, you sinned against me, then my right response is not to defend myself, but to recognize if I've done wrong, to confess that and own it. So it's not about being sinlessly perfect, thank the Lord. But it is about regarding his commandments and his word on a daily basis and walking in those commandments. So to say you worship him, but then to disregard his word is vain worship.